All right, everybody, Pedro with LTS, and this week's video is going to be a very important one. Nothing gun related. It's going to be so you guys get to know the person who created Cole Gunsmithing, a person that trained me, has trained many people that work here, and you get to know a little bit how his head works, what he sees for the sport, his personality. I have no questions, I have no book, I have nothing. It's simply a conversation with, I think a lot of people like to have this conversation, but it's impossible to get the man to sit down and stop because he does stuff all day. So hopefully you have a glance at what's going on. So this is Richard Cole, the owner, the gunsmith, stock maker, basically everything that everybody does around here. He has touched everybody in teaching them how to do things. So Rich, please introduce yourself, where you come from, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Pedro. Hi everybody, I'm Rich Cole, and where do I come from?
I think it would be a great place to start from the very beginning. The day you said, I want to get into this crazy business of shotguns, which gun related, when you say people, I sell guns, first thing they tell you, oh, I have this Glock. And then you have to tell them, I don't to do with those. Yeah. So how did the shotgun came along?
Yeah. I decided that I was going to become a gunsmith when I was a young boy. I probably was 10 years old. And I was at my grandmother's farm in Mendham, New Jersey. They were dairy farmers. And I was a kid I lived just outside of Washington, D.C. My father worked for Johns Hopkins University. He was in applied physics and he was a rocket scientist, which I am not. And I was at my grandmother's farm, and I saw a groundhog out in the field where the cows were, and my uncle said, well, take the .22 rifle and go and see if you can get the groundhog. And so there was a single shot Remington bolt action .22 rifle, and I went all the way up into the attic and opened the window up, and lo and behold, I shot that groundhog. And I mean, it was like the crowning day of achievement for my life, and at that, it just was one of those things that, looking down the sights, feeling the walnut in the stock, feeling my finger on the trigger and the steel, and smelling the smell of the gunpowder when I opened the bolt and ejected that cartridge after shooting that groundhog. I was like, this is going to be my life, And 10 years old, I had a few ups and downs over the years, to put it in place. I originally, wanted to go to gunsmithing school. I was unable to do that. I was very fortunate that I was hired by Beretta as a young man, and that to me was a blessing. It was about being in the right place at the right time, and having the work ethic and the attitude. To be able to take it from there.
But you went to Beretta for shotgun gunsmithing?
I went to Beretta to become a gunsmith.
Didn't matter what it was?
It didn't make any difference what it was. It made no difference what it was. To me, it was the idea of being trained up to be a gunsmith. When I went to Beretta had very recently bought out the assets of Garcia Corporation. And they were south of Washington, D.C. in Accokeek, Maryland, where they still have part of their factory, and they're not manufacturing there, but they've got offices and everything there. That all got moved through the process of the M9, U.S. Army service pistol. But when I went down there and I was there, they probably only had 35 or 40 employees. Here they were just getting started. And I was interviewed, had a brief interview with the HR director, and she brought me in and actually had a few minutes with Buer Bogild, who was the technical manager, one of the finest technicians I've ever known.
How long ago was that?
It was 1979, 1980.
50, 45?
45 years ago. Good
memory.
Yeah, 45 years ago.
No. Can you remember what you had for breakfast yesterday?
No.
Okay.
Actually, yesterday I did. I had a smoothie for breakfast. But, I went in and, Bureau Bogild, I mean, this guy, he was a Danish arms master. He was trained in the Danish army, and he was erect. He sat up straight, and I mean, his posture, and he had that heavy Danish type of an accent, and it was obvious to me that this guy is squared away, And we talked a little bit, and he realized that I had the fire in my belly. I really wanted to do it, and I had done enough mechanical type work in my young life to that I was trainable, and I think that he was able to tell that I was oriented enough towards the attention to detail that I wasn't a monkey wrench guy. Mm-hmm. And he marched me over to the general manager's office. Believe it or not, I mean, the company was so small. I mean, a new hire had to be approved by the general manager, and Bob Bonaventure, God bless him, he ruled with an iron fist, but he was fair. Nobody in that company was not scared of Bob Bonaventure. He was something else, but he was fair, and he was brilliant. And it was under his direction that brought Beretta USA at that time really to the forefront, and to be able to be doing what they're doing now.
Back in those days, they were already bringing just some of the SO3s, SO2s, S2s.
It was SOs at that time, because now let's call it 1980, just around the numbers up. So in their fine side locks, it was basically the SO3 and the SO4. The SO3 was their game gun, and the SO4 was the target gun.
Back in those days, bunker trap.
It was basically bunker trap, because sporting clays was, it wasn't a thing, certainly in Europe. I mean, I think that Brian Belinsky and some of that crew was just kind of pushing sporting clays and kind of getting that started. So principally, what they were is, SO4s were trap guns, and they were also some skeet guns. Okay. And the SO3s were the hunting guns. But to go back to Bob Bonaventure, I just want to say, Bob said, I'll hire you up, but you got to work. All I can pay is $5 an hour. And I was like, at the time I was earning $13 an hour on a construction job, and I was like, it made no difference to me. You know what I mean? The idea that I was going to get work, I had a pickup truck and a dog. I mean, $5 an hour, I didn't care. I mean, and part of anyone's success in anything in life is you got to have a fire in your gut.
You gotta want to do it.
You gotta want it, man. You gotta want it, and you gotta understand you're not gonna. It's gotta be more. It's gotta be about more than money. There are a lot of very, very affluent people, and more power to them. There are a lot of them that aren't very, very happy with what they had to do to get where they're at, and they're still stuck in it. Mm-hmm. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that there have been some pretty rough patches, in the career, in my personal career, and in aspects of Cole Gunsmithing, But I mean, overall, I'm going on 69 years old. I still enjoy it. I like to come to work and see the guys. And, mm-hmm. I go in the back room and I tell them, I love you guys. You're my family. You're my boys.
So you start a Beretta, and then you start working on pistols.
I actually started on the assembly line of the 950 BS, which was a 25 ACP and a 22 short tip-up barrel. Uh-huh. They were being manufactured by, I think it was either Garcia Corporation or Firearms International, because in the 1968 Gun Control Act, they enacted a point system for handguns. And a handgun had to qualify with a certain number of points in order to be able to be imported into the country. And that's why if you look back at some of these pistols that were produced at that time that were imported, they had very, very odd things, like the Model 70S 22 pistol. Okay, in order for that, so that's a small, medium to small size 22 long mm-hmm. rifle semi-auto, right? It's not a target pistol, but it has a thumb rest grip, has adjustable sights, and a finger rest on the bottom of the magazine. Those were all things to build the points so that pistol could be imported and sold in the USA. So anyway, the 950 BS, it was being manufactured there. It was the only thing that was being manufactured at Beretta USA. Everything else was being imported. They had the Model 70S in 22. They had it in 380. those were great steel frame, straight blowback, pistols. They started in then on the aluminum double action pistols, the Model 81, the Model 84. There was the old James Bond pistol, which was the Model 9032 ACP. We were importing the very end of the 92 S's, which was the predecessor to the M9, the M9 today. And then in the shotguns, which I got excited about, in the side-by-sides, they had those nice box lock guns, the 400 series, they had the 424, the 425, the 426, the 427 EL, and the 427 EELL, which is just a beautifully made high-grade wood side plate game scene engraved gun, very scarce.
So those are the predecessors to the 620
to the 620 series, yeah.
Okay.
And the difference was those 400 series, they had a roller latch in the fore end. And
they didn't have the standard button or latch.
They didn't have the answer push rod.
Okay.
Yeah, you rolled it and you took it off. It was the same fore end latch as the old now what we call them here in the U.S. the BL3, BL4 over under shotguns. Those actually their designation was an S55 and S56, and then they had the 57 and 58 as the higher grades. But they had those roller latches on those.
And at that time, were you working with any of these shotguns already?
Only a little bit. Only on semi-autos. They moved me out of I went from the assembly room after several months. They moved me into the service department. The service department had one guy, Pete Valentine. Pete Valentine.
You remember the names?
Oh, let me tell you something. Pete and I, man, we ended up being buddies. We hunted ducks together. We had a blast. I can't even talk about some of the stuff that went on. I mean, we really had a good time there. It was Southern Maryland, back in the heyday, and we had a really good time. I just embraced the lifestyle. It was just unreal for a young guy. But Pete Valentine. Pete needed help badly, okay, and Pete went on strike. He said, I'm not filling a parts order. I'm a gunsmith. I need a parts guy. I'm not going to fill a parts order. Pete Valentine, and there was a time at Beretta that they hadn't sent a spare part out for a year because Pete just said, I'm not filling parts orders. So they moved me into the service department with Pete, and we shared a secretary with another department. There was a paper stack that was 18 inches high of parts orders, and we had these metal file cabinets where you went to the pistol, say Model 70S, disconnect. You go to the 70S, right? You pull the card file, you go down and you find the part number on there. You pull the card file up, and it gives you a location. You go get the part, and then you mark -1. That was the inventory. I mean, this is old school stuff. It took me 6 months to fill all those parts orders before I was able to touch a gun. And my first guns that I worked on were the A301 shotguns, which is the predecessor to the A303.
Wow.
They had a lot of those guns that the same scenario. Shooters wanted to shoot lighter loads here in the U.S. and they're shooting in Europe. So every single gun that came into inventory, we had to change the recoil spring on it. So there are pallets of guns. Richard Cole, he's changed recoil springs till my fingers were bleeding for weeks. But that was a lot. That was a lot of it. And I mean, that's a lot of just paying the dues. But Pete was a great teacher to me, and eventually I got to do some pretty cool stuff and go over and work in Italy. And
we at the Cole here. I've been here for 6 years. We had some gunsmiths come in and leave, and the one complaint that the new gunsmiths that left had is I always work on the same crap all the time, which is that we start them in semi-automatics, which is the easiest to learn, right? And the one complaint was always, I only do semi-autos, and telling people is like, how long do you think it takes people to touch, let's say, a DT11, a Perazzi, or do you think you start as a gunsmith and straight up you're gonna go in and fit a locking bolt?
Well, again,
and that's why I wanted this conversation, because there must be people that watch the YouTube and they want to be gunsmiths, and so you can kind of they can kind of have an idea that when you become a gunsmith, you're not gonna start
You don't
work
start
on very high-end guns.
No,
you're gonna change springs for a long time.
That's right. I mean, that's just the reality of it. You know, there's a, it's kind of like a dating relationship. You know, we got to kind of get to know each other, you know, before we're going to get married. You know, and you know, an individual has got to develop the skill set, and then there's just simply the practical reality of the business. I mean, we have, you know, we are not a charitable organization. I rephrase that. My wife gives away a bunch of stuff to these kids.
Do,
but
Jonna does. You do, and there's a lot.
The reality is, we got to earn a living, right? I mean, you can't be charitable, you can't be philanthropic and do things for other people if you don't first put a meal on your table, pay for the lights, get back and forth to the job.
We can provide the service, right?
That's right. You know, so you know the reality of the business is that we have jobs that are here that tend to be somewhat repetitive and mundane.
But you should be able to do it with your eyes closed by the end of the year.
Well,
that's what we kind of.
If you can't, you're never going to make it to the next step.
Right.
I mean that's the reality.
I cut you off there. Sorry. So you went to change springs from all the incoming guns.
Oh, I was just saying. You know, it sounds very, very glamorous. Oh, you know, people say, oh, Rich Cole, you know, he was an apprentice at Beretta, and that's where he was trained. That's true. That's right. I spent there a lot of hours when I wished I could have been doing anything else. You know, I mean, you just have to pay your dues. You know, and you put your time in. And you know, as I worked, and you know, over the years, really, I mean, after I left Beretta, I left in 1985.
But you did get to go to Italy.
Yeah. I spent some time in Italy, and you know, and I worked in Italy. I spent a lot of time in Italy after I actually left Beretta, and I was working with Fratelli Poli. And Fratelli Poli is a small family business where they do a lot of gun repair. They repair semi-auto shotguns. They repair, you know, side-by-sides and over-unders, and they build shotguns from parts sets, which is probably a whole nother conversation because it's very, very in depth about how the Italian gun trade works. You know, these small manufacturers, they build really nice shotguns, but they don't have machine shops in the back room. They're not filing everything from a billet of steel. You know, so that they use
one company vendors. Will make a whole bunch of stuff, and then you assemble, staple your name, and
exactly. That's kind of what they're doing. And the Polies did that, and you know, it was wonderful. You know, working with them, and you know, and from there, you know, I just got to know a lot of people in Italy in the trade.
It was during that time that you met Ed Anderson.
Ed and I, gee whiz, God bless him, we miss Ed. Ed and I got to know each other. We never physically worked together. Ed came on to Beretta after I was already gone from Beretta. Just like Tim Ward. You know, Tim, we do a lot of work with Tim, another good gunsmith, a really capable guy that, you know, we work together with Tim on stuff. Tim came on after I was already gone and off sort of doing my own thing. You know, when I left, I actually left to go back to Maine, where I had some family in Maine there, where I spent a little bit of time with as a teen. And
so you left. What is the plan or the great idea of saying I'm going to open my own gunsmithing business? Because you didn't start selling guns; you were straight up gunsmithing.
No, I only did gunsmithing for years. I didn't really start selling guns until probably the mid-1990s. I was only doing gunsmithing work easily for 10 years. And, you know, basically what I was doing is that I wanted to become an all-round gunsmith. I mean, I really wanted to learn about some of the things the gunsmiths were doing that we weren't necessarily doing at Beretta. And I had received enough training at Beretta that I was viable to continue working with them. So, for example, some of the jobs at Beretta, they were trying not to work on what they would consider obsolete model guns. They were sort of phasing out those S55, S56 guns. And I had a lot of experience with those. And so Beretta referred a lot of people to me.
At that time, how old were those guns?
Those guns were produced in the 1960s, and they were discontinued in the 1970s, the end of the 1970s.
So they're about 25-year-old gun already.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's normal. Most companies,
Right, that's right. They're sort of phasing those out. I mean, the 680 was the 680 and the 686, and there was also a 685. But that 680 series over under shotgun, that put Beretta on the map. for over-under shotguns, because they went from, if historically speaking, you go back to the inception of the Beretta design over-under shotgun, which was like the model S1, and that's in the late 1920s, somewhere in there, and it was a Holland style side lock with that modified Kirshner lock that Beretta uses today, that they still use on the DT11, you know, and that was the first gun. They basically produced that gun, and then they produced that AS model, which is the one that has the same kind of crossbolt,
which
but
is
it has
the actual predecessor to the DT, right? In that case,
in effect, effectively, sure is, Pedro. And they produced those guns. Those guns were produced in the typical old school way. If they take the parts out of the bin, they fit them, they get them all right, they serialize them, they heat treat them, they blue them, case harden them, whatever they're going to do. Then they come back to assembly. All the parts have to be readjusted there after heat treatment. Yep. They put them back together again. Beretta, with better machining technology, okay, went from that type of a process into the S55, S56 series, to whereby that was the first gun that Beretta produced, where they were able to manufacture the parts and assemble blued parts. There was still a lot of fitting that needed to be done, but it wasn't fitting that required the rebluing of the barrels and frames and that. And then they went from that to, in effect, what we would consider today as close to totally interchangeable as can be in the 680 series. And that 680 series just ended up being such a good gun. It took basically the locking system of the S55, S56, and it incorporated it into a gun that was made more by machine than by man. And so the tolerances and the interchangeability of spare parts came up to a very, very efficient level.
Which it's a big thing, because we all love things that are handmade, right?
Yes.
We seem to think that it is handmade, therefore it's worth more or it's better. But I think that was the big thing that took Beretta, from what I learned, right, watching this whole thing over the years, is that, one, they were the biggest, and once you start putting together machining, which is by far more accurate than a human will ever be, and then you have the human that can fine-tune it, that's really where things start getting these guns that will last.
Yeah, that's right, and I mean that's still, you know, in the if you look at, say, clay target sports, high volume guns, truly high volume guns, you know, the predominance of those guns are just several manufacturers, you know, and there's manufacturers, you know, probably the first one, I couldn't be wrong, but I look at Perazzi. I look at Daniele Perazzi. Daniele Perazzi, Ivo Fabri teamed up in the early 1960s. In 1977 was the Perazzi Type 4. And that's the most successful competitive clay target shotgun that was ever built in the international arena for international trap. Okay, they took the Boss design. It's a Boss design. It is a Boss locking system. The recoil shoulder system.
And then they put that into Boss. But back then, those weren't the Type 4 anymore wasn't hand filed.
No,
it was CNC.
CNC. 1977 was the Type 4, and that basically is a machine-made gun. Okay, with just a little bit of hand work. Now, I'm not being dismissive of the handwork. They had very, very skilled people, just like they still do at Perazzi, that make very, very small adjustments to the parts.
What's everything?
To put them together so that they all come together. A very, very similar situation now with Krieghoff in the K80. Blaser, you know, the F3 Blaser, again, very, very, very similar, very, very little handwork, almost no handwork at all. Kolar, the same thing. Beretta in the DT11s, now the incredible SL2 platform, the SL3 in the game gun. Zoli, you know, again, very, very little handwork. You look at the industrialized production. These guns, when they machine them, they're keeping very, very close quality controls on all of the parts so that they don't have to make modifications. The heat treating is another big aspect of this. They're heat treating in lots using industrial standards. You know, on some of these old guns, you know, we make a part for the gun, okay? The only methodology we've got for truly for heat treating is you take a torch, you heat it up, you see how hot it gets, you quench it and casing it, and then...
No science
and then
behind it.
No, but there's...
You eyeball it.
There's 100-year-old science, you know, and it works. It's effective. But that's not necessarily the best methodology for somebody that wants a gun to shoot for 50,000 rounds before it needs some, you know, some additional form of service. I mean, we're seeing Perazzis. I know of several Perazzis that have in excess of 1 million rounds fired through them.
Oh, yeah.
Now, are they ready to go to the great gun god in the sky? Perhaps, but you know the point is that the guns that are being produced today in these higher quality guns are, in my opinion, as somebody that has worked on them over the years, they're better today than they were back then. You can't take away the perception of the artistry and the functional artistry for, you know, for the skilled artisan who's filing and working and you know, creating the parts from forgings and things like that. Pretty remarkable what companies like Peyote, for example, the Bertuzzi brothers, you know, the Polies, some of those, they're remarkable pieces of functional art.